Good afternoon. I had to think about when I was filming this. The time is starting to get away from me a little bit. I'm filming this lecture on education from the Panic Room once again. Um, in the way of announcements, let's stop and take stock of where we stand. First of all, give yourself a pat on the back because you have now completed, at least on the lecture side of things, the second part of this class, our focus on stratification, race, gender, or social class, and globalization. All right. So now we are going to transition into the third section of our course, which is all about social institutions. The first of which I'm going to cover one that I think is near and dear to all of our hearts, and one that we're certainly every single one of us is engaged in, and that's the institution of the education system. Okay. So what I want to do today is give you an overview of the education system, and I want to answer or to take steps to try and answer a very important question, which is, what is the effect of schools on inequality? Okay, what is the effect of the school itself? We always hear about funding for education. We always hear about school quality as a primary factor of any social discussion that we have about inequality. So I will try my best to answer that question today. Now, in the way of announcements, if you are behind, I strongly urge you to get caught up. I strongly urge you to take the steps that you need to take in order to catch up. Do not miss assignments. The absolute worst thing you can do for yourself at this moment is to take a 0. So I'm happy to take late work with a late penalty. Do make sure you get all of your work in to me. Okay. Second announcement, assignment 2, that is going to be due on Friday. There will not be a lecture video posted that day. Originally, that day was to be canceled so I could be in Cleveland to present some of my research at a conference. However, no conference means no travel, which means no lecture that day. Since that was canceled on the syllabus, I am not going to revoke that original decision that I had made. But assignment 2, please do make sure that is turned in 9:15 a.m. on Friday morning. Okay. So anyway, let us get to the lecture material. Okay, so here's my agenda for the day. I will start with a broad discussion of education and schooling. I will then talk a bit about what the functions of education are. And most of my time today in this video, I would like to spend discussing school quality. How do we measure it? How does it affect individuals? What is the connection between the quality of a school that one attends and social inequality throughout the life course? All right. So the first question I have that I want you to think about is, why should one care about the education system? I cannot spend the time over the next few weeks discussing every single social institution that exists. So I've had to make decisions. I've had to pick the institutions that I personally feel are the most important for us to care about. And I'm starting with education not by accident. This seems to show up in every single discussion about policies surrounding social advancement. So why care about education? The answer to that, I would think, would be obvious. We care about education for 2 reasons. One, it is viewed as generally the best path of personal advancement. People always tell you, invest in yourself. If you get an education, then nobody can ever take that away from you. If you get a college degree, then that will have myriad benefits for you throughout the rest of your life. And that is a value that many people do want to really hold on to very closely and tightly within our society. It is also viewed very often as a primary mechanism by which social inequality is reproduced. Okay, so for a very long time, sociologists have pointed out the fact that, yes, social mobility exists in a capitalist society, but it's probably not as easy as we would like it to be. So why is it that children that are raised by poor parents so often grow up to become poor adults themselves? Now, that's by no means guaranteed, but it is the trend that we observe when we compare somebody's income to the income that their parents themselves earned. All right. And so in that way, often one of the questions, or one of the answers to that question that is given, is that, well, poor children receive a very substandard education, and as a result, they find themselves unable to advance themselves in society and in the labor market, and to do the types of things that they would need to do in order to be able to experience social mobility. However, there's a really important question that we need to stop and ask, that we need to actually stop and quantify. And that's, if we put this much importance on the idea of schooling, if we put this much importance on schools themselves, I would want to know, how much time do you actually spend in a school? So what I want you to do now is to think in your head, what percent of your waking hours, so forget about sleep, but waking hours from birth to age 18, would you estimate you have spent physically inside a school? Education feels like an all-encompassing institution for so many of us, but I want you to just actually think about this for a second. How much time do you actually spend inside of a school? The answer is, if you guessed 13%, I'm guessing you didn't, but that is the answer. From birth to age 18, proportion of waking hours that children spend in school, it's 13%. The first time I heard this in a graduate seminar when I was at Ohio State in grad school. 13%. I immediately whipped out my calculator and tried to calculate this for myself, and I gave myself absolutely no sick days, no reasons for missing, no reasons for ever being out of school, and I came up with 13%. Now, if we reduce that to just one calendar year, so you take away, age 0 to 1, 1 to 2, 2 to 3, 3 to 4, times when children are not often in school, although as we are going to see, it's kind of stupid to just pretend like that period of our lives doesn't exist and doesn't matter. I still only get to 25%. In one calendar year, you only spend about 25% of your waking hours inside a school. And if you reduce that to one academic year and remove the summer, which, as we're going to find out, is even stupider, we only get to about 32 to 33%. Okay, so we're not spending as much time in a school as we think we are, right? A lot of people seem to guess between 45 and 55% many times, and that's just far overestimating the amount of time that we actually spend physically inside the four walls of this particular institution. So that's going to be my starting point for trying to theorize about how schools really matter. Like, not just, I know that schools matter, but how they really matter. We spend a lot more of our time outside of a school than we physically spend inside of the school, okay? And yet, almost every policymaker, be they liberal or conservative, talks about schools. It's a very easy and quick way to capture the attention of families and parents, is to talk about schools and education. So almost everybody agrees, whether you're liberal or conservative, that this is something that people need to pay attention to. Now, they may disagree on what specifically is the issue with schools or what specifically to do within education systems. Liberals are always talking about funding and equity within schools, and conservatives are always talking about how do we find out who the bad teachers are, fire their asses. I want to forget about that entire discussion for a second, and I want to actually ask, what qualifies as a good school? And there is an answer to that. I mean, we can talk about a good school as a safe school, and a good school is a place that nurtures critical thinking. But at the federal level, at the level of policy, we do have an answer to this, and it has nothing to do with safety or whether or not people feel emotionally and mentally stimulated. Students, and by extension, the schools that they go to, are overwhelmingly evaluated through their test scores. So if enough students are passing their standardized tests, we call that a good school. And if enough students are failing their standardized tests, we then call that a bad school. However, what that is doing is making an assumption, and this is an assumption, that the achievement level of a student measures the school quality, that what the student achieves is a direct measurement of the quality of the school that they are going to. Now, I agree, achievement has to matter. I mean, I wouldn't be in the business of giving out grades if I didn't think the grades mattered. But just by looking at that, at the cross-national data here, we can see that the United States lags pretty far behind many of our industrialized counterparts in student achievement, okay? So if we look at science and we look at math, I can see that East Asian and Northern European countries are doing pretty darn well. The country that has, by and large, the best education system in the world, according to the data, is actually Finland. So how do we catch Finland, right? That's the question. Finland's science and math scores, like how can we approximate that without also approximating Finland's absolutely insane drinking problem and all the problems that brings down upon their society as well. The United States just doesn't do very well on test scores, okay? But I'm going to argue shortly that that's looking at the wrong thing. Instead of asking, we should be asking other questions besides just why is the United States so far behind the Japanese and the Finnish school children. But for now, for this slide, what I want you to take away from it, the key idea here is that we, as a society, appear to have made a decision that we can measure our schools and the quality of those schools based on the test scores of the student body, okay? So keep that in the back of your head, because the next thing I want to do is actually take a bit of a step back here and think about macro theory, really theory in all its ways, macro and micro, and try to apply that to education. So if we think about things in a functional sense, functionalism, you will remember, is this kind of family of macro assumptions that argues that things and institutions exist in society to produce an interrelated type of interdependence across the various things that any society has to do. And so we know that education is serving a social function. For example, first and foremost, it is transmitting skills. It's giving people the skills that they need, we hope, in order to be fully contributing and fully contributing members of society. You go to college first and foremost, so you can get a job once you get out of here that's going to be A, socially necessary, and B, personally able to support you financially. Okay. Education throughout the life course also serves to create peer groups. A lot of your friends, I suspect, both now and in the past, are people who you went to school with. And I think about all the friend groups that I've had. I have a friend group from high school, I have a friend group from college, and I have a friend group from grad school, right? Almost every friend group that I have throughout my life has come to me through the education system. It has come to me through my participation and attendance at various schools. The American education system also does a lot of socialization. There's a lot of things you pick up in school about how to be a member of society that aren't necessarily being taught to you at home or aren't necessarily being taught to you in other organizations or institutions that you might participate in, like church, for example. So the education system serves to socialize us. In fact, if we think about the American education system, it is based upon the German system. That's why so many of our education terms, like kindergarten, are derived from German words that tell you the same thing. And that education system is based off the East Prussian model, which itself was very upfront many years ago about that it really wasn't trying to train people to be critical thinkers. It was training people to be citizens of the new German state. It was training people with the skills they would need to be good, obedient citizens. So if you think about how much of school is not really about being able to do math or being able to do fractions or being able to comprehend the Huckleberry Finn, for example, so a lot of it is about sit still, look pretty, be able to handle boring material for long stretches of time. All of these are things that do help you when you get out of school and help you move on. So we know that in a large society, in mass society, these tasks need to be centered in institutions. We simply cannot treat everybody as an individual. So if you remember my whole discussion about bureaucracy many years ago, we have to actually organize these things into institutions. And there is not really a coincidence that school is an institution. Right? Education always existed. But if you think about the difference between an apprenticeship you might have had in colonial times, let's say, and going to school now, it's a world of difference. And that's because if you were an apprentice in some type of economic task, I can treat you as an apprentice. I can treat you as an individual. But when I have a whole bunch of students in a very large class, I can no longer do that. Okay. So functionally speaking, the larger our populations go, the more people we have that we need to impart skills upon. And that needs to be institutionalized through the form of formal organizations, which today we call schools. Okay? So that's the functional look at education. However, if I wanted to let's say, put more of a conflict theory perspective on this, that would lead me to something that's known as social reproduction theory, which argues that schools are the primary mechanism by which inequality in society, the inequalities endemic to society, are reproduced across generations. Okay. And the first thing that people often point to when they try to make this point is how schools are funded, and especially if I compare American educational performance to those of Northern Europe or East Asia, this is one of the areas where you can see a big difference because while the United States has some extremely good schools, like some of the American schools are the best in the world, we also have some schools that are the worst in the industrialized world, and that is coming out of policy. That's coming out of an understanding of where school funding comes from. So if you look at a country like Finland or Germany or Japan and Korea, countries with very strong educational outcomes and good test scores, they do a lot more centralized funding. That is, whether or not you're talking about a very wealthy area of Bavaria in Germany or a poorer area of the former East Germany, they're all still getting a lot of money from the state level to educate their children. And as a result, where you started isn't always the best predictor of where you're going to end up, okay? Whereas in the United States, similar thing happens in Japan across rural areas and extremely wealthy urban areas like Tokyo and Osaka. The amount of money that flows into schools is very much dependent on how many kids go to that school, not really on what the wealth level of that population is. So in Germany or Sweden or Finland, for example, they are funding schools in a much more equitable way. Whereas in the United States, we fund our schools locally. This is why so many people my age always like to live in cities, except the second our kids turn 5, we all have to move out to the suburbs in order to get them in a quote unquote better school district. It's not hard to see why people feel this way. School funding in the United States depends on local property values. We fund these overwhelmingly through property taxes. Yes, there is some state money that flows to schools. Yes, there is some federal money, but somewhere between 60 to 65% of all of a school's funding is coming from local property taxes. And that's just the way it's been in the United States since the end of World War II. So think back to our discussion on racial segregation last week. If we have certain areas that have been redlined or prone to white flight and prone to economic disinvestment, we end up with a situation where the property values are heavily degraded in areas that are already poor, and specifically areas that are primarily inhabited by racial and ethnic minorities. And it does force those children born and growing up in those areas to be starting from behind because they are not getting the type of funding and educational investment in their futures that people might be getting in much wealthier and often whiter places that people might live. All right. So once you get into school, you're already kind of starting from behind and you're already getting less investment in your future if you just happen to live in an area with very low property values. If the houses are not, if the houses do not have a high property value, if the businesses do not have a high property value, then the schools are going to be poorly funded, no matter how many people happen to be going there. And then once you get into school, there's all sorts of mechanisms that occur that serve to worsen this pre-existing inequality that's already kind of built into the system. So what I want you to do, especially if you're working from home here, you can ask your parents about these two things, ability grouping and tracking. Tracking especially is a really important way to understand educational inequality. But ability grouping, ability grouping, let's start with that. Ability grouping is something that actually follows very, very clear educational research and sound educational research, where students who are all at the same kind of level academically and skill-wise are grouped together because it's more fulfilling to be able to learn at that pace and the pace that is afforded by, say, the kind of middle ground of whatever class that you're in. So you take the students that are all kind of scoring generally pretty well and put them in a group. Now they take classes together, and that puts them into a tracking system which opens doors at a later point of the education system. Okay, so tracking, to be a little more clear about what that means, a tracking might be, well, okay, because you did well on your entry test scores as a freshman in high school, you're going to be put in advanced math, and that is going to open up, say, while everybody else is taking pre-calculus, now you get to take advanced calculus, and this opens up all sorts of later classes for you at a later point that might put you on a track to maybe go to college and major in something in the STEM field, where we know the salaries are pretty high if you can make it through it. Ability grouping and tracking are things that occur in about 60% of primary schools in the United States and 80% of secondary schools. Now, I have to admit, part of me believes that this is a good thing. Part of me does believe that, yeah, okay, people do learn best when they're surrounded by people that are kind of sharing their same level of academic skill and proficiency. And I just think about the hardest class that I teach every year is my department's quantitative methods course, which is statistics. And I've actually had some students who have said to me at some point, Dr. Schoen, I actually became a sociology major because I don't want to do math. And then they realize later, oh, wait, I have to do a very math-heavy course because 80% of sociology is statistics and inferential data analysis. So when I get that class, the difference between high and low students is just absolutely massive. So I will have, like, say, these 4 students have taken AP Stats and they know the system a little bit. These 4 students don't even know what a median is. And guess who I have to teach to in that environment? So you risk ending up a situation where the students on the one end feel overwhelmed and the students on the other end feel bored. And it ends up with a situation where nobody's happy. It's a real balancing act on my part. So while I do agree that there's some reason to do this, let's look at the effects. Because once you are not in, say, that quote unquote gifted track, I very much feel that this relates in this results in a type of labeling effect. Labeling theory starts to become very useful here, where people get labeled as, well, you're in the remedial class, or even you're just in the normal class. You're not a gifted student. You're getting that label. You are not a gifted student. Well, maybe I'm just not good at school, and that might lead me to not try as hard going forward. And if I stop trying, that is literally how people do poorly in school. It also, as I've already said, determines your future coursework. It may open up certain tracks for you that weren't afforded to the earlier to the lower levels of academic skill. Essentially, the groups of people that most need investment, the students that aren't doing well already, end up not getting that investment because the most resources, the best teachers, the most equipment, all tends to flow to that gifted track. And I understand why those students are being invested in, but it does create a situation where students at the lower end of the distribution do not get the investment they might need in order to help them get caught up and brought up to speed. Finally, just being put in a gifted track, let's say, depends heavily on SES, which is socioeconomic status, okay? And once we talk about how schools actually matter and how people enter schools with different levels of academic skill, that will likely make a lot more sense, okay? Now, so moving on, if we think a little bit also about symbolic interactionism, I think there's a really interesting thing going on here in terms of expectations that you have for yourself and the expectations that I have for you. Okay, so remember, symbolic interactionism is all about how we're playing roles and interacting creatively with one another. Teacher expectancy effect is the idea. It's the concept that your teacher's expectations of you is going to influence both your performance, but also how you personally expect to do. If I'm constantly telling you I believe in you, if I'm constantly telling you that you can do this, that will have an effect on you. Conversely, if I am constantly telling you that you can't do it and that you're not college material, right? I'm not going to say that to anybody in the room. I don't believe that for anybody in the room. But if people are constantly saying that to you, that you aren't college material, it might only be a matter of time before you start to internalize that and believe that. So the question becomes, we know that social expectations that are placed on us are something that may affect how we view ourselves and will affect how we ultimately perform in these types of situations. So the question becomes, do you feel you are evaluated fairly and objectively in every social situation that you might find yourself in? And the answer to that is unfortunately no, like absolutely not. Okay. So a whole bunch of research, just a slew of research demonstrates that, yeah, the teacher expectancy effect is real. And there's many things that might influence how I view you and how I judge you. So the first one that seems certainly to me most applicable to Albion is your past work and my ability to talk to other teachers. I am aware that there's a website called Rate My Professors where you get to write all sorts of about reviews about the people that teach you, and there's just like nothing anybody can do about it. You have these the course evaluations that you turn in. It's your chance to evaluate us. And I used to think, yeah, it'd be great. Why don't I have that? Why isn't there a situation where I get to just sort of anonymously evaluate my students and talk shit about my students? And then I realized, yeah, that totally exists already. It's called department meetings. And yes, we do talk about you at those. So, if you get a reputation with certain professors, this student's really bright and very responsible, that gets around. If you are believed to be a real pain in the ass by somebody, that also gets around. And it does affect the way that I might view you, and I try very much not to do this. But socially speaking, I do think that there's a very real discussion to be had about how someone's reputation might affect just how teachers are viewing that person in the first place. Another good example of how past work influences current expectations going forward is when I get my class roster at the beginning of every semester and I see who is enrolled in my course. I already know right on that sheet which ones of you are on the dean's list and which ones of you are on academic probation. That's very much something that could, if I allow it to, influence what I expect out of you and how I expect you to apply yourself. Somebody's name, language, and accent, right? We're going back to race and ethnicity here, especially in terms of what we expect. Different ethnic groups have different stereotypes attached to them about their ability to do well in school. And people likely internalize that in an implicit way, even if we don't want to, even if we don't want to apply those types of stereotypes back to our students. How physically attractive you are is proven to be something that does play into this. And I thought, really, how could that be? And then I came across another study when I was doing research for this a while back. And it says that your professor's physical attractiveness is something that affects how you evaluate them as well. So when it comes down to it, we're all just extremely shallow. How you dress, right? How you choose to present yourself. That's the presentation of self that is going to affect whether I think somebody is serious or someone is not serious. Your race and your gender, right? I already talked about ethnic stereotypes. Let's think about gender here as well. 60% of all college degrees are currently being awarded to women, right? And so I do think this is creating a situation where men are looked at almost as defective girls in the classroom, and that's not fair to boys and to young men once they get to higher levels. Your family's socioeconomic status is something, if that becomes known, I start to think about how that has affected your previous preparation to be a member of a college classroom. What your parents do for a living, has been proven to be part of this. And then finally, where you sit in class. If you sit kind of front and center, that means I'm making eye contact with you more. That means that there's just a little bit more accountability than if you're sitting all the way in the back of the room and perhaps falling asleep. So seating in class just little things like that, little things and where you choose to be in the classroom and how you choose to present yourself can lead to your professor or to teachers at any level really holding that unfairly against you. So when it comes down to it, the expectation effect is something, even if we know it's there, even if we know it's silly, it's probably pretty difficult to deny that that does matter, because most of us are aware that we're not always judged fairly in society. And most of us are aware that we're not always judged objectively in society. So the educational institution is a complicated thing, a very complicated place. What I want to do now is try to answer this question about how schools really matter. So the first metric, what I'm going to do here is present to you 3 metrics, 3 ways in which we might look at the school as a whole and say, yes, that's a good school, or no, that is a bad school. And the first is one of the things we've already discussed and already covered at length, because this is the way that the United States, almost all of it, evaluates its schools. Grades, achievement, how you do on test scores, specifically standardized tests. So I teased this a little bit earlier and tried to preview where this was going. Do grades, does how you perform on a standardized test measure the quality of your school? The answer is no. Achievement is far better predicted by family influences. This was true when Coleman looked at it in 1966. It was true when Jenks studied it in 1972. And Doug Downey, a friend of mine actually, confirmed this in 2015, that, yeah, the way people perform on tests is much better predicted by family background, right? The size of your parents' paychecks, the size of your parents' wealth and bank accounts, and ability to put you in a position to learn without distractions, and to be able to give you these opportunities. Okay, so what we see is background is a really meaningful thing here. It's a famous psychological study from Hardin Risley in 1995, which did a very simple thing. It put a tape recorder, with informed consent, obviously, we put a tape recorder in the apartments and houses of people who had just recently had a child. And they just counted how many words per hour were spoken to those newborn infants. For the lower class households, it was 616. For the working class, a little over 1,200 an hour. And for the professional classes, 2,100. I look at that and I say, is it any wonder that people are showing up on the first day of kindergarten already reading and comprehending things at different levels? It's not that the lower class, what's up with the lower class there? Why aren't poor parents reading to their children? Why aren't they talking to their children? Do they just not love their kids? No, of course not. It has nothing to do with that. It's everything to do with do you need to work right away? Do you have access to something like maternity leave that allows you to spend time speaking to that infant and reading to that infant? And then if you do have to go back to work, do you have the ability to put them in a daycare or in some type of preschool that's going to really give them a leg up? If you remember when we did our poverty budget exercises, where you had to spend some money on childcare, and everybody was spending way, way, way less money than they otherwise would have needed to. You can get sort of unlicensed care that doesn't really do much except make sure that child doesn't roll on its stomach and die. Or you can get the ones where they, serenade the babies with Mozart and all sorts of weird crap like that. The point of the story is, these inequalities are there. These inequalities are starting well before school ever had its chance to get its hands on you. And again, let's just go back to the numbers here. Part of the reason I feel the effects of schools themselves is overblown: 13% versus 87%. Why are we assuming that the 87% is somehow going to be less meaningful than the 13%? So anyway, we make a mistake by evaluating schools through an achievement metric. Now, the second metric is what's known as learning, or a value-added approach. So this is a simple metric of, if we know that people are starting at different spots, it's probably not fair to say, like, what if you have a school where people start not being able to read, and then by the end of the year, they are able to read, but perhaps not at grade level. Should we say that that's a failing school just because their kids are still kind of far behind? Or should we say, no, that school actually taught people how to do something really important. It's just they were starting from a far previous point. That's called the value-added approach, okay? Now, how much do students learn in a given time frame? And really what it does is it tries to normalize for where people are starting at. So another way to think about this might be if I spent several months playing basketball, doing nothing but playing basketball, if I spent several months working on my three-point shot, I would likely get a lot better at shooting three-pointers. But that right there doesn't mean, just because I may have gotten better at shooting three-pointers, that doesn't mean I'm ready to go play for the Boston Celtics. So I shouldn't be compared to professional basketball players. What I should be compared to, what my coach there should be compared to, is where I was starting from and where I ended up. So instead of just looking at one test scores and saying you passed or you failed, what this metric will do, and it's already happening actually, this is being used. This metric is being used already in Tennessee, the Carolinas, both of them, a couple of other states as well, is I take a test. Let's say I do a standardized test at the start of the school year and another standardized test at the end of the school year. And it's a measure of how much I learned in a given time frame. And even if my scores aren't really that good, if there was significant improvement over the school year, we might say that that school is doing pretty well. The obvious problem here should be the exact same as what we saw with the first metric. Learning is something that reflects a lot of non-school factors as well. So in the same way that in the poor, working class, lower class segments of society, in the same way that those parents don't have the economic resources to invest in their children quite the same way, the learning approach here is prone to the very same issues. So do you have your own room, your own quiet room where you can go to do homework without distractions? Do you live in a safe environment where you feel comfortable going to school every day? Non-school factors are the primary determinant of your pace of learning. So even if you have a school that does a really good job with its students, if the rest of the house is not in order, so to speak, if everything outside of the school isn't in order, students will not learn the way that they could. They will not learn at their highest possible, at their best possible pace. And of course, don't forget about those pesky summers. That is a good segue to my final metric here, metric number 3. What if we looked at the rate of learning while you are in school versus the rate of learning when you are not in school? Because clearly, as we've shown with the other two metrics, non-school time matters. What happens outside of school matters for how you're doing when you're in school. So this was proposed by a buddy of mine, Doug Downey, who's a sociologist I really admire quite a bit, actually. He tried to figure out and came up with a beautifully simple explanation. Is there a time of your life, or I should say not a life, but is there a time of the year in which anything you learn and anything you accomplish is a byproduct of purely non-school factors? Put another way, that what happens during the school year is a product of what's happening in the school and a product of what's happening outside of the school. But if we look at the summer, anything you accomplish in the summer can only be a result of non-school factors. So essentially, that's what we're doing here. I want to compare your rate of learning during the school year to your rate of learning when you are not in school. And that's the academic year versus the summer term, because summer learning can only be a product of non-school factors. And if we look at the data on this, it's really, really interesting. Whether or not you are rich or poor or anything in between, high and low socioeconomic status students learn at a nearly identical rate during the school year. They are not all achieving the same things, but the rate of learning is actually the same during the school year. But over time, middle and upper income students continue to gain a little bit during the summer, whereas low-income students actually lose quite a bit of what they have over the summer. So that is where this achievement gap is coming from. The summer. Now, if you've been paying attention to this video, you'll realize this is going in the direction of me suggesting year-round schools, which some countries do. They have the exact same number of school days as we do, but they spread them out. They have longer, more frequent breaks. They have more frequent breaks, but each break is a little bit shorter. So you don't have this 4-month gap in which coming back to school really feels like knocking the rust off and not even really, learning anything for a full week or for a full month almost, because you have to constantly catch up from the whole gap that opened over the summer. And that's really where this achievement gap is coming between socioeconomic classes. People are falling behind over the summer and not ever being caught up. So if you look at the gaps that exist when people are at age 18, it's the same gaps that were there when people were at age 5 before schools ever had the chance to get their hands on them. All right. So this is my argument. My argument has always been this: schools just don't really matter. I don't really matter in the way that we think they do. I just feel like that you look at the teachers in some of these, it might be a really good school. Can the teachers be that much better? Can the teachers be that much smarter and more dedicated? I kind of doubt it, but I do think that if I look at what low-income students are doing over the summer, it's a lot of hanging out. It's not a lot of things that are very academically enriching. Whereas for middle and upper income students, you might be going to science camp, or you might be taking music lessons. You're doing a lot of things that keep you mentally invested and able to continue learning. Okay. So when we reevaluate school quality, the fundamental thing that I'm learning, schools are good. Schools are not a driver of inequality. Schools, if anything, are evening out some of the rough edges of society. And to make that point, I want you to look at this graph here. If you follow my cursor, the box plot that you see on the left, that is a sample of schools measured by the current achievement metric. So that's test scores. And anything in the bottom quintile, all these schools that are shaded in black, those are schools that are currently designated to be failing because too many of their kids are failing their standardized tests. Then if I go to the middle box plot, it's the same collection of schools, but what if we evaluated them by learning? How much are students actually learning? It's starting to get messier all of a sudden. And I can see that some schools where students are failing their tests are actually doing a pretty good job with the learning side of things. They are teaching their students, but those students are just too far behind to fully be caught up in the course of a year. But the learning rate is strong. And interestingly enough, there are some schools down here. Do you see these circles that are not filled in? That's a school where everybody is passing their tests, but nobody is actually learning, right? That would be a bottom quintile school. And then if I look at the impact metric, the measure of how well you learn in the school year compared to the summertime, I can see that all of a sudden it's a real mess, right? There's a lot of schools that are currently deemed failing that are doing the absolute best they can for their students, that are doing a really good job for their students. But again, why are you expecting 87% of your time to not outweigh 13% of your time? So the overall finding here, the big takeaway, is that schools themselves have only a contextual effect on social inequality. And when we say, why is it that American students don't score as well as students in Finland? I think that's fundamentally asking the wrong question. The question is not why are Finnish schools better or why are Canadian schools better. The question is, why is it so much harder to be poor in the United States than it is to be poor in Canada or Finland? Why do those societies construct a system where the poor are able to learn at a similar rate to the wealthy students, and we can't do that? And to me, that is not inevitable. There is no reason why it has to be that way. But as long as we continue to test students to death, and as long as we continue to have this massive summer break that simply doesn't really help anybody, and as long as we continue to fund schools through local property taxes, this will likely continue to happen. So one final comment about year-round school. I realize that that's the type of thing that I would have hated if I was when I was a little boy. But you don't let your kids smoke and drink whiskey either. Kids don't get to choose what they want to do. They don't get to construct policy. Adults have to do what's in the best interest of children in many cases. And so all of us have graduated. It's easy for us to say this, that we graduated, lower levels of school at least. But I fundamentally think that's where it's going. The reason why we have such an extended summer break, summer vacation, that goes back to a time when 40% of America made their living through agriculture and they had to be available for the harvest. Now, 0.9% of Americans make their living through agriculture. So the reason for this summer break existing is not there anymore. We are simply just married to tradition. And I want to encourage you to think very creatively about what schools really mean. So if you went to a school that was bad, that you feel was bad, don't misunderstand this as me telling you that your take or your perception of your school was wrong. But think a little bit about why your school felt bad. Think a little bit about why people seem to be falling behind at your school. It likely had very little to do with the school itself and everything to do with the society that school was personally embedded within. Okay? So anyway, while my argument is that schools don't really matter, education itself and skills itself absolutely matter. And the credentials matter quite a bit. And that is where my video lectures are going to pick up with on Wednesday. Thank you very much. Keep trying to challenge yourself out there. And I'm more than happy to answer questions by email or by Skype that any of you may have regarding how to do really well on this assignment going forward. Thank you very much, and talk to you soon.